There is a question that has followed humanity for as long as we have been pulling bones from the earth. A question so vast, so strange, so stubbornly unresolved that scientists have spent entire careers chasing its edges, and still, to this day, cannot quite agree on the answer. It is this. Why did the dinosaurs disappear? You might think you know. Most people do. There was a rock. It fell from space. The dinosaurs died. That's the story we learned in school, the one printed on museum placards and narrated over sweeping documentary footage of empty plains and ash-darkened skies. But here is the thing about that story. The more carefully you look at it, the more you turn it over in your hands, hold it up to the light, trace the edges of what we actually know versus what we've assumed, the stranger it becomes. Because the asteroid did happen, that part is real. But the extinction is something else entirely. Something messier, slower, more complicated, and in many ways far more mysterious than a single rock from space can explain. So tonight, as you settle in and let the weight of the day begin to soften around you, we're going to take a long, slow, gentle journey into one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in the history of life on Earth. We're going to walk through a world that no longer exists. We're going to ask questions that scientists are still arguing about, and we're going to sit quietly with the beautiful, humbling strangeness of not quite knowing. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let us begin. Close your eyes for a moment, or let them rest softly if you prefer, and try to imagine a world that no human being has ever seen. Not even in the farthest edges of memory or myth. A world so different from our own that if you were somehow placed there, in the middle of it, you might not immediately recognize it as Earth at all. This is the Late Cretaceous period, approximately 66 million years ago, and it is in many ways an extraordinary place to find yourself. The air is warmer than anything you've experienced in your lifetime, not the sharp, dry heat of a desert, and not the suffocating humidity of a modern jungle in midsummer, but something in between. Something lush and thick and breathing. The planet is running several degrees warmer than it does today, and the result is a world blanketed in green. Deep, layered, ancient green. Forests that stretch from coastline to coastline across continents that are not yet arranged in the shapes we know. Inland seas that divide what will one day be North America. Shallow oceans teeming with creatures that have no modern equivalent. And above all of it, skies that have never been empty, because the pterosaurs are there. Enormous, membrane-winged, riding the thermals over landscapes that do not yet have names. It is worth pausing here, as we often do not, to appreciate just how long the dinosaurs had been around by this point. When we talk about the end of the dinosaurs, we tend to frame it as the end of something fragile, something small, something that perhaps could not cope with a changing world. But that impression is deeply, dramatically wrong. Dinosaurs had existed on Earth for approximately 165 million years before the event that ended them. 165 million years. To put that in some perspective, modern humans, Homo sapiens, our species, us, have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. If you compress the entire history of the dinosaurs into a single calendar year, human civilization doesn't appear until about 1159 on the 31st of December. We're a footnote. We're a breath of condensation on a cold window. The dinosaurs were not some brief flailing experiment that the universe quickly abandoned. They were one of the most successful groups of large animals this planet has ever produced. They survived ice ages, they survived volcanic eruptions, they survived the slow shifting of continents and the rising and falling of seas. They had evolved into thousands of species, filling every ecological niche from the smallest fern-nibbling herbivore to the most terrifying apex predator the land has ever known, and they were still going. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand as we begin this story. At the moment the asteroid arrived, if that is in fact how we should describe what happened, the dinosaurs were not in decline. They were not struggling. They were not a dynasty already crumbling at its foundations. They were, by most measures, flourishing. The late Cretaceous was a period of tremendous dinosaur diversity. In what would become North America, Tyrannosaurus rex had only recently evolved into its final, almost impossibly powerful form. The ceratopsians, horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, Torosaurus, and Dozens of their relatives as were at their most varied. The hadrosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs, had spread across multiple continents in an enormous array of species, some with elaborate crests and head structures whose function we still don't fully understand. In what would become Asia and Europe, other lineages were thriving. Long-necked titanosaurs, the last of the great sauropods, still tending to their eggs in nesting colonies that must have been vast and noisy and alive with the calls of hatchlings. Ankylosaurs with their armoured backs and club tails. Pachycephalosaurs with their thick domed skulls, apparently given to headbutting in ways that bring to mind certain large ungulates of our own time. And then, of course, there are the smaller ones, the ones that tend to get lost in our imaginations when we think of dinosaurs. Small feathered theropods, already showing clear evolutionary relationships to modern birds, the ancestors of what would eventually become wrens, hawks, parrots, and penguins were already moving through the underbrush and among the lower branches of late Cretaceous forests. In a very real sense, one that we will return to later in our journey tonight, the dinosaurs never entirely ended, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point, for now, is this. The world 66 million years ago was not a world on the verge of collapse. It was a world in full voice, rich, complex, ancient, and full of creatures that had been perfecting their way of life for longer than the mind can truly hold. And then something happened. What that something was, and more importantly, why it killed what it killed and left alive what it left alive, is where our story truly begins to get strange. Because the mystery of the dinosaur extinction is not simply a question of what hit the Earth. We are fairly confident something did. The mystery is the shape of the aftermath, the pattern of who survived and who did not, the things that don't quite fit together when you lay them all out on the table and try to make them tell a single coherent story. Let us start at what most people consider the beginning, the impact itself. There is a layer in the geological record, found all over the world on every continent in sites ranging from deep ocean sediments to high mountain outcrops, that marks the boundary between two geological periods. Below this layer, a world full of non-avian dinosaurs. Above it, a world from which they are completely, abruptly absent. This boundary is called the KPG boundary, K for Cretaceous, PG for Paleogene, the period that came after. It used to be called the KT boundary, the T standing for Tertiary, the old name for the period after the Cretaceous. You may still hear it called that in older texts. What makes this boundary remarkable, what made scientists sit up very straight when they first began examining it closely in the late 1970s, is what the layer itself contains: iridium. An enormous, anomalously large concentration of iridium, a metal that is vanishingly rare in Earth's crust but relatively common in certain types of space rocks. And this iridium layer is not found in one or two places. It has been discovered at more than 200 locations around the world, always at the same geological horizon, always corresponding to the same moment in time. The physicist Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter Alvarez, along with their colleagues, published a paper in 1980 proposing what at the time seemed like an extraordinary, almost science fiction-like idea, that a large asteroid had struck the Earth at the end of the Cretaceous, and that the resulting explosion and global environmental disruption had caused the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. It was not immediately well received. The scientific community is, quite rightly, sceptical of large dramatic claims. And this was about as large and dramatic as claims get. But then, over the following years, the evidence accumulated. And in 1991, a crater was confirmed, buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, Chicxulub crater. Approximately 150 kilometers in diameter, the result of an impactor estimated to have been between 10 and 15 kilometers across. That is not a rock, that is a mountain. A mountain of space rock, travelling at roughly 20 kilometers per second, slamming into the shallow waters off the coast of what is now Mexico, with a force estimated at somewhere between 100 million and 500 million megatons of TNT. The numbers are genuinely beyond human comprehension, so let us try to approach them sideways. The largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, the Soviet Tsar bomber, tested in 1961, released energy equivalent to approximately 50 megatons. The Chicxulub impactor released, by conservative estimate, roughly 2 million times that much energy in a matter of seconds. It, vaporized everything within hundreds of kilometers instantly. It sent a shockwave through the Earth's crust that triggered earthquakes and volcanic eruptions across multiple continents. It hurled an enormous amount of material, vaporized rock, dust, debris, high into the atmosphere and beyond, some of it escaping Earth's gravity entirely and some of it raining back down as a global bombardment of superheated particles that, for a period of hours after the impact, may have raised surface temperatures to levels capable of igniting wildfires across the entire planet. And then came the darkness, the dust, the smoke from wildfires, the sulfur compounds released from the particular type of rock the asteroid happened to hit, which were rich in sulfates, all of this rising into the upper atmosphere, spreading around the globe, blocking sunlight. How long the darkness lasted is still debated. Some models suggest months, others suggest years, possibly longer, but however long it lasted, its effects cascaded through the food web with devastating efficiency. No sunlight. Plants cannot photosynthesize. Plants die. The animals that depend on plants lose their food supply, and then the animals that depend on those animals lose their food supply. Up and up the chain, the disruption travels, until even the largest and most powerful creatures on the planet are starving in a world that has gone cold and dark. This is the impact winter, and it is, in broad outline, the story most of us know. So why, you might ask, does this still not make sense? Because when you look closely at the pattern of who died and who survived, when you examine the timing and the geography and the biological details, the story starts to develop fractures, small ones at first, then larger ones, until you find yourself staring at a set of facts that don't quite assemble into the clean, simple narrative you thought you understood. And that, dear listener, is where the real journey begins. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. We have a long way to go tonight. Here is the question that haunts paleontologists more than almost any other when they consider the end Cretaceous extinction. Why did the crocodilian survive? Think about that for a moment. We have just described a world impact of almost incomprehensible violence. We have described an impact winter that blocked out the sun for potentially years. We have described a cascading collapse of food webs from the bottom up, and yet, sitting there on the other side of all of it, blinking their ancient eyes in the slowly returning sunlight of the early Paleogene, are the crocodilians. Large, cold-blooded, metabolically demanding carnivores. Animals that depend on warm temperatures to be active. Animals that are, by any reasonable measure, considerably less adaptable than many of the dinosaurs that were supposedly driven to extinction. And it is not just crocodilians. Turtles. Sea turtles, freshwater turtles, land tortoises, they made it through. With their slow metabolisms, yes, but also with their dependence on aquatic ecosystems that were themselves severely disrupted. Many marine groups were devastated by the extinction event. Ammonites, those beautifully coiled cephalopods that had been swimming in Earth's oceans for more than 300 million years, were entirely wiped out. Mosasaurs, the great marine reptiles, were gone. Plesiosaurs, gone. And yet turtles, which share many ecological characteristics with these groups, persisted. Snakes survived. Lizards, for the most part, survived. Many amphibians survived, despite being among the most environmentally sensitive creatures on the planet. Small mammals, obviously, survived, and this is usually explained as the most straightforward part of the story. Small body size, omnivorous diet, ability to burrow underground and shelter from the worst of the environmental disruption. But birds survived. And this is where the story becomes deeply strange. Birds are dinosaurs, not metaphorically, not in a poetic evolutionary sense that requires you to squint and tilt your head. Scientifically, rigorously, taxonomically, birds are theropod dinosaurs. They are nested within the dinosaur family tree the way humans are nested within the primate family tree. When a sparrow lands on your windowsill, you're looking at a dinosaur. When a crow solves a puzzle to retrieve a hidden piece of food, that is dinosaur intelligence at work. And birds, small-bodied, feathered, many of them at least partially capable of flight, survived the end Cretaceous extinction and went on to diversify into the more than 10,000 species that share our world today. So the question becomes acute. If birds survived, why didn't other small-bodied, feathered dinosaurs? Why didn't the small maniraptoran theropods, some of which were no larger than modern chickens, make it through? Many of them must have been burrowing, or at least capable of sheltering. in dense vegetation. Many of them were likely omnivores, capable of eating insects, seeds, and small animals in addition to whatever plant matter was available. The honest answer is, we don't entirely know, and this uncertainty is not due to lack of effort. Paleontologists have spent decades trying to work out exactly which bird groups existed before the extinction, which ones made it through, and what characteristics distinguish survivors from victims. The picture that has emerged is fragmentary, frustrating, and deeply fascinating. What we think we know is this. At the time of the extinction, there were multiple lineages of birds. Some of them, possibly many of them, went extinct along with the non-avian dinosaurs. The survivors appear to have been ancestors of modern birds, and they may have had certain characteristics that gave them a slight edge. Perhaps the ability to eat seeds, which can remain viable in the soil for extended periods even without active plant growth, providing a food source during the darkest years of the impact winter. Perhaps greater flexibility in diet and habitat. Perhaps something about the structure of their development, their reproductive biology, their metabolic capacity. But here is the thing. When you try to define exactly what made bird survivors and other small dinosaurs victims, when you try to draw a clear line between the two, you run into the uncomfortable truth that the line isn't clear. It's blurry. The traits that we identify as survival advantages in birds were present, to varying degrees, in many of the dinosaur groups that didn't make it. And so the question remains open, nagging, unresolved. This is one of the great intellectual pleasures of paleontology, in a way. It is a science that works with incomplete evidence. The fossil record is, by its nature, a biased and fragmentary sample of past life. And the incompleteness means that there is always more to discover, always another angle to consider, always the possibility that the next excavation site will overturn what we thought we knew. But the crocodilian problem is particularly stubborn. Let us sit with it a little longer. Crocodilians at the end of the Cretaceous were not all the small semi-aquatic creatures we associate with the group today. Some of them were enormous, terrestrial predators capable of competing with large dinosaurs for resources. The late Cretaceous and Paleogene saw a remarkable variety of crocodilian forms, including species that were fully terrestrial hunters and others that had evolved to eat plants. After the extinction, virtually all of these diverse, varied crocodilian forms disappeared. What survived were the semi-aquatic, freshwater and marine-adapted forms, essentially the body plan we still see today. And this gives us a clue, perhaps. Aquatic environments, particularly freshwater ones, may have been somewhat buffered from the worst effects of the impact winter. In a world where photosynthesis has largely shut down, freshwater ecosystems can continue to function for some time on detritus, dead organic matter falling into water from the surrounding landscape. The food chain becomes dead stuff fuels bacteria and fungi, which fuel invertebrates, which fuel fish, which fuel larger predators including crocodilians and turtles. This detrital food web is a slower, less flashy energy source than the photosynthesis-based food webs of terrestrial environments, but it is more resilient. It can sustain itself through darkness. This is the detrital survival hypothesis, and it explains some of what we see, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't fully explain why freshwater turtles survived while marine plesiosaurs did not. It doesn't cleanly explain the distribution of survivors and victims among invertebrate groups in the ocean, and it doesn't explain the birds. So we keep looking, we keep asking, and we keep running into one very uncomfortable possibility, which is this. Perhaps the impact alone, as enormous and devastating as it undeniably was not the whole story of the extinction. Perhaps there were other things happening, things that had been happening for much longer than a single day in the late Cretaceous, things that had already been stressing ecosystems, already been thinning populations, already been reshaping the world in ways that made some groups more vulnerable and others more resilient. Perhaps the asteroid did not so much cause the extinction as deliver the final decisive blow to a world that was already, in some respects, struggling. And if that is true, if the story is more complicated than a single catastrophic event, then the mystery deepens considerably. Let us explore that possibility now. There is a place in west-central India called the Deccan Plateau. It stretches across an enormous expanse of the subcontinent, more than 500,000 square kilometres of terrain covered by what geologists call flood basalts. Layer upon layer of volcanic rock, dark and dense, telling the story of one of the most sustained and powerful episodes of volcanic activity in Earth's history. These are the Deccan Traps, and they are extraordinary. The eruptions that created the Deccan Traps began approximately 2 million years before the end of the Cretaceous and continued for some time afterward. At their peak, they were releasing enormous quantities of volcanic gases into the atmosphere: carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, water vapor, and a host of other compounds that would have had significant effects on the global climate. Let me be specific about the scale, because the numbers matter. During the most intense phases of the Deccan eruptions, the volcanic system may have been releasing gases at a rate equivalent to several large volcanoes erupting simultaneously, more or less continuously, for hundreds of thousands of years. The total volume of lava that poured out and spread across what is now India during this period has been estimated at roughly 1 to 2 million cubic kilometers. That is not a geologic footnote. That is one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the Earth. And here is the thing that makes this so pertinent to our story. The timing is almost impossibly interesting. For most of the period from about 68 to 67 million years ago, the Deccan eruptions were ongoing but relatively moderate. Then, around 66 million years ago, right around the time of the Chicxulub impact, the eruptions intensified dramatically. The most voluminous phase of Deccan volcanism appears to have occurred very close to, and possibly in direct response to, the asteroid strike. Some researchers have proposed, controversially but not unreasonably, that the seismic energy released by the Chicxulub impact, which was immense enough to send waves reverberating through the entire planet, may have triggered or intensified the Deccan eruptions by disrupting magma chambers and volcanic systems that were already under pressure. The planet rang like a bell, as some have described it, and the vibrations may have uncorked volcanic systems on the other side of the world. This is a hypothesis, not an established fact. The relationship between the impact and the volcanic intensification is still actively debated, but the correlation is striking, and it matters because it complicates the simple impact story in important ways. If the Deccan Traps were releasing large quantities of volcanic gases before the asteroid arrived, and there is good evidence that they were, then the ecosystems of the late Cretaceous were not operating in pristine, stable conditions at the moment of impact. They were already experiencing a slow, grinding alteration of their atmospheric and climatic context. Volcanic CO2 emissions cause warming. Volcanic sulfur dioxide emissions cause cooling, sometimes dramatic short-term cooling. Events as sulfate aerosols form in the atmosphere and reflect sunlight. When the two effects compete, you get climate instability, swings between warmer and cooler conditions, disruptions in precipitation patterns, changes in ocean chemistry as CO2 dissolves into seawater and shifts its pH. Ocean acidification is particularly important here. Many marine organisms build their shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate dissolves under acidic conditions. If the oceans were becoming more acidic due to elevated CO2, both from volcanic sources and later from the impact itself, which would have generated enormous quantities of CO2 by vaporizing carbonate rocks at the impact site, then organisms with calcium carbonate shells would have been under increasing stress even before the darkness of the impact winter arrived. This may help explain why the ammonites, those beautiful coiled shells, went extinct, while nautiluses, their relatives, survived. Nautiluses have a somewhat different shell chemistry and live at greater ocean depths, where the environmental conditions may have been less dramatically altered. But I want to be careful here, as responsible science demands. The Deccan hypothesis is not settled. There are researchers who argue that the Deccan eruptions, while certainly significant, were not sufficiently intense or sustained to cause a mass extinction on their own, and that without the asteroid impact, the dinosaurs and other late Cretaceous fauna would have survived the volcanic episode relatively intact. There are others who argue that the Deccan volcanism was the primary driver of the extinction, and that the asteroid delivered a killing blow to a world already weakened by hundreds of thousands of years of volcanic disruption. And there are those who think the two events, volcanic eruptions and asteroid impact, interacted in complex ways that neither alone could fully explain, creating a compound catastrophe unlike anything life on Earth had previously experienced. What is remarkable, and what I find quietly stirring when I contemplate it in the deep hours of the night, is this. We're talking about events 66 million years ago, events that left their traces in rock and chemistry encoded in ways that patient science has slowly learned to read, and yet we are still arguing about the details, still discovering new evidence, still refining our understanding. The Earth keeps its secrets long and well. But there is yet another layer to this mystery, one that the impact and the volcanism together still don't fully explain. To understand it, we need to look not at the sky or the deep crust, but at the fossil record itself, at the pattern of disappearances in the millions of years before the final boundary. Because when you look carefully at the dinosaur fossil record in the late Cretaceous, something unexpected begins to emerge. This is one of the most hotly contested questions in all of paleontology, and it has been generating arguments between scientists for decades. Were the non-avian dinosaurs already declining, in terms of diversity, population, ecological dominance, before the asteroid hit, or were they doing just fine and struck down at the height of their powers? The answer matters enormously for how we understand the extinction. If the dinosaurs were already struggling, then the asteroid may have been the final straw for a group already in trouble. If they were thriving, then the speed and completeness of their extinction is even more remarkable, and the survival of crocodilians and birds is even harder to explain as a simple function of body size or habitat. The evidence here is genuinely mixed, and the debate reflects something important about the limitations of the fossil record. When we count dinosaur species through the late Cretaceous, tracking how many distinct species appear to be present in different geological formations at different times, there does appear to be some evidence of declining diversity in certain groups in the 10 or so million years before the extinction. Sauropod diversity, for instance, the long-necked giants that were so dominant in the Jurassic, seems to have declined significantly by the end of the Cretaceous, particularly in the northern hemisphere. But is that a real signal, or is it an artifact of the fossil record? This is the central methodological challenge. The fossil record is not evenly distributed. Some time periods and some regions are represented by abundant, well-preserved fossils, others are represented by almost nothing. The patterns we see depend heavily on where people have been looking, what kinds of rock are available at the surface to be found, and what preservation conditions existed at the time. A genuine decline in dinosaur diversity would look similar, in the fossil record, to a period when there just aren't many rocks being deposited in the right conditions to preserve fossils. Researchers have spent years trying to develop statistical methods to correct for this sampling bias, to distinguish real ecological signals from the distortions introduced by an incomplete record, and their results have not always agreed with each other. Some studies, using sophisticated statistical models, have concluded that dinosaur diversity was genuinely declining in the last few million years of the Cretaceous, that the group was contracting, becoming less varied, occupying fewer ecological niches. These studies tend to support a picture of the extinction as the culmination of a long decline, with the asteroid accelerating and completing a process already underway. Other studies, using different methods or different datasets, have found little or no evidence of pre-extinction decline. In these analyses, the dinosaur fauna appears to have been reasonably diverse and ecologically complex right up until the very end, with the extinction happening as a sharp, sudden event rather than a slow fade. And then there is a third possibility, which is perhaps the most interesting, that different groups of dinosaurs were doing different things. Some lineages may genuinely have been contracting, losing species diversity, becoming more restricted in their ranges. Others may have been expanding, evolving new forms, filling new ecological roles. The extinction did not necessarily fall on a uniformly prosperous or uniformly struggling group. It may have hit different dinosaur lineages at different points in their own individual trajectories. This heterogeneity matters. It may help explain some of the patterns in the extinction, why some groups seem to disappear rather cleanly, and others have a more ragged end, though it doesn't resolve the fundamental puzzle of why no non-avian dinosaur lineage survived at all. There is another angle worth exploring here, and it comes from what we know about the geography of the late Cretaceous. 66 million years ago, the continents were not where they are now. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower. A great shallow seaway, the Western Interior Seaway, divided North America into eastern and western landmasses. India was an island, moving northward toward Asia on its tectonic plate, not yet collided with the mainland. The world's landmasses were configured differently, and this affected which animal populations could interbreed, which species could spread to new regions, and which lineages were isolated and thus more vulnerable to localized environmental pressures. Some researchers have noted that the dinosaur fauna of the latest Cretaceous in North America, where we have the best fossil record, may represent a geographically isolated community, somewhat cut off from the rest of the world's dinosaur diversity. The Western Interior Seaway made North America effectively two separate land masses, and the dinosaurs of Western North America, the Hell Creek Formation fauna, the Triceratops and T-Rex world, may have been an island community in some ecological sense, with limited influx of new species from elsewhere. If this is true, then the picture of declining diversity we sometimes see in North American records may reflect regional conditions rather than a global trend. The dinosaurs of Asia and South America, where our fossil record is thinner, may have been doing something quite different. We don't know. That is in many ways the most honest thing to say. We don't know. And I find something oddly comforting in that honesty. Not because ignorance is a virtue, but because it means the question is still alive, still being asked, still capable of yielding new answers as new fossils are found, as new dating techniques are developed, as new ways of analysing the data we already have are invented. The mystery has not been solved, and that means the investigation continues. Let us turn now to one of the most dramatic and debated aspects of the extinction event itself, not what caused it, but how fast it happened, and why the answer to that question changes everything. In our imaginations, the dinosaur extinction tends to happen quickly. The asteroid hits, the world darkens, and then the dinosaurs are gone, perhaps over the course of weeks or months. A sudden silence falls over the Earth. The geological record, read carefully, suggests something rather more complicated. One of the most fundamental challenges in understanding the end Cretaceous extinction is the question of temporal resolution. How finely can we actually date the events we're looking at? When we say an organism disappeared at the KPG boundary, what exactly does that mean in terms of real time? The short answer is that our ability to resolve events in deep time is limited. When we date rocks from 66 million years ago, even with the most sophisticated radiometric techniques, we are typically working with uncertainties of tens of thousands of years, sometimes more. A period of 30,000 years, which would feel like an almost incomprehensible span of time to a human being, shows up in the geological record as essentially a single moment. This means that what appears to be simultaneous disappearance in the fossil record might actually represent a series of extinctions spread over tens of thousands of years. Conversely, what looks like a drawn-out decline might actually have been quite rapid, just spread across more rock layers because of variations in sedimentation rates. This is not a counsel of despair. It simply means we need to be careful about our language. When we say the dinosaurs went extinct at or during the KPG boundary event, we should hold that claim loosely, acknowledging that the precision of our dating is limited. With that caveat firmly in place, let us look at what the evidence actually shows. In the best studied sections of the record, particularly the Hell Creek Formation of the Western United States, which represents a sequence of rocks laid down in the last few million years of the Cretaceous, there are some genuinely puzzling patterns. The Hell Creek Formation spans approximately 1.5 million years of the latest Cretaceous. During this time, the diversity of dinosaurs preserved in the formation appears to change. In the lower portions of Hell Creek, there are more species represented. In the uppermost portions, the last 100,000 years or so before the KPG boundary, the record becomes thinner, less diverse. For a long time, this was interpreted as evidence of a genuine pre-extinction decline. More recent analyses have suggested that the pattern may be partly or largely explained by the 3-meter problem, the observation that the last 3 meters of rock below the KPG boundary in many Hell Creek sections are essentially barren of large dinosaur fossils, while fossils are present below and the KPG boundary is clearly defined above. The 3-meter problem might mean that dinosaurs were genuinely absent from these environments in the last period before the asteroid struck, evidence of real ecological contraction. Or it might be a preservation artifact. Large animals are less likely to be preserved as fossils than small ones, and any disruption to the environment in the period leading up to the impact, perhaps related to Deccan volcanism, or to climate fluctuations, or simply to changes in the depositional environment of the Hell Creek area, might have reduced preservation rates for large dinosaur bones without necessarily reflecting a real decline in their populations. Distinguishing between these possibilities is extraordinarily difficult, and people have tried very hard. But here is perhaps the most striking thing about the speed question. When you look at what happened to the survivors, the speed of the extinction is actually quite remarkable, regardless of what was happening in the lead-up. Consider the mammals. At the end of the Cretaceous, mammals were mostly small, mouse-sized to badger-sized by and large. Ecologically, they occupied the niches that small mammals occupy today: burrowing, insect-eating, seed-eating, living in the shadows of the dinosaurs. There were a few larger forms, but nothing that could remotely compete with even medium-sized dinosaurs for ecological dominance. Then the asteroid hits, and within, geologically speaking, a blink of an eye, perhaps 10 to 20 million years, mammals have diversified explosively into the ecological roles vacated by the dinosaurs. The first large mammalian herbivores appear, then the first large predatory mammals, then the first marine mammals, the ancestors of whales and dolphins and seals, then the first bats, the first primates, the first elephants. The speed of this mammalian radiation, following the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, is one of the most dramatic examples of ecological release in the fossil record. It tells us something important. The dinosaurs were not occupying their ecological roles by chance or by default. They were actively holding those niches, competing successfully for them, keeping the mammals small and marginal. The moment the dinosaurs were removed, the mammals flooded into the vacant ecological space with extraordinary speed. This, in turn, tells us that the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was real, rapid, and complete. Whatever happened at the KPG boundary removed them, or at least the largest, most ecologically dominant forms, quickly enough that the mammalian radiation began almost immediately. So the extinction was fast in geological terms. But how fast? Some researchers have argued for a geologically instantaneous extinction, everything non-avian dinosaurian disappearing within a few thousand years of the impact. Others see evidence of a longer, more drawn-out process in different parts of the world. The debate continues. What is clear is that within the span of what the geological record can resolve, a period that may represent anywhere from a few thousand to a few 100,000 years, the non-avian dinosaurs were gone, and then the mammals were not small anymore. The world had changed, irrevocably, and the question of why it changed in the specific way it did, who survived and who didn't, why the crocodiles made it and the ceratopsians didn't, why birds are with us and mosasaurs are not, is still being asked. Let us turn now to the ocean, because the marine extinction is a story unto itself, and it contains some of the deepest puzzles of all. The oceans at the end of the Cretaceous were not the oceans we know today. Picture them, if you will, as you let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The Cretaceous oceans were warmer, particularly in their shallower regions. They were more extensive, covering more of the continents than modern seas do. They were populated by creatures that have no living descendants. The mosasaurs, enormous, paddle-limbed lizards, distant relatives of modern monitor lizards that had adapted to a fully marine existence with terrifying efficiency. The largest of them could exceed 15 meters in length, and were arguably the apex predators of the Cretaceous oceans. Fast, maneuverable, capable of catching anything that swam. Their teeth were designed for crushing as well as gripping, and stomach contents found in some specimens suggest diets ranging from fish and ammonites to smaller mosasaurs, turtles, and seabirds. The plesiosaurs, a separate lineage of marine reptiles with long necks or massive heads, depending on the group, paddle limbs, and no visible tail flukes. They were not lizards or dinosaurs, they were their own ancient lineage, having entered the oceans back in the Triassic period. By the end of the Cretaceous, plesiosaurs had diversified into many forms, from the very long-necked elasmosaurids to the short-necked, large-headed plesiosaurs whose jaws could apply crushing force to almost anything unfortunate enough to fall within their reach. Both groups, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, disappeared entirely at the KPG boundary. And yet marine turtles survived, as did sharks, the lineage that gave rise to the great white shark. The hammerhead, the tiger shark, was already old by the Cretaceous, and it sailed through the extinction with barely a ripple, comparatively speaking. Why did the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs die while the sea turtles and sharks lived? The standard answer involves metabolic rate and body size. Turtles have low metabolic rates. They don't need to eat very much to survive. A sea turtle can fast for extended periods if food becomes scarce. Sharks, while more active, have been feeding on whatever falls their way for hundreds of millions of years, and their diversified diets and physiological flexibility may have helped them through the period of food web collapse. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, it is argued, were large active animals with high energy demands. They needed to eat a lot, and they needed to eat regularly. When the food web collapsed, when the fish populations crashed, when the ammonites disappeared, when the smaller prey species were dying off, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs simply ran out of food and starved. It is a plausible argument, but it is not entirely satisfying, because here is the problem. The largest sharks at the end of the Cretaceous were not small. They were not low-energy, slow-metabolizing creatures existing on the margins. They were apex predators competing directly with mosasaurs in many environments, and they survived. The difference, if there is one, may have more to do with reproductive biology than metabolism. Sharks reproduce relatively quickly. They reach maturity faster than mosasaurs, and while their clutch sizes are small, they are capable of rapid population recovery after disruption. Mosasaurs, as far as we can tell, gave birth to live young and may have had relatively slow reproductive rates, similar perhaps to modern large marine reptiles. When a catastrophe kills a large fraction of a population, the survivor's ability to recover depends critically on how quickly they can reproduce. A species that reaches reproductive maturity in a few years and can produce many offspring has a much better chance of rebuilding from a small founding population than a species that takes decades to mature and produces few offspring at a time. This is, in fact, one of the most important general principles in extinction biology. Large, slow-reproducing animals are consistently more vulnerable to extinction than small, fast-reproducing ones. The KP extinction, whatever its precise mechanisms, seems to have followed this principle, but with enough exceptions and complications to prevent it from being a clean, explanatory framework. And then there is the deepest puzzle of the marine extinction, the ammonites. Ammonites were cephalopods, relatives of squid and octopus, but encased in a coiled external shell. They had been swimming in Earth's oceans for more than 300 million years. They had survived every previous mass extinction event in Earth's history, bouncing back even from the catastrophic end-Permian extinction of about 252 million years ago, which killed somewhere between 80 and 96% of all marine species. The ammonites had survived all of it. For 300 million years, whenever disaster struck the oceans, the ammonites had endured, diversified, filled vacant niches, and carried on. They were, by any measure, one of the most resilient and adaptable groups of marine organisms that had ever existed. And then, at the KPG boundary, they were gone. Every last one of them. No species, no lineage, no survivor. Their nautiloid relatives, the nautiluses, made it through. Different shell structure, different habitat. Preferences, nautiluses prefer deeper water, but the same basic body plan in many respects. Why did the nautiluses survive when the ammonites did not? This question has occupied cephalopod specialists for generations, and while several hypotheses have been proposed, differences in early development, differences in shell structure, differences in habitat, none of them is entirely satisfying. The ammonites were one of the most extinction-resistant groups in Earth's history. They had survived everything. And then, suddenly, they didn't. The irony is almost poetic. The group that had been most successful at surviving previous catastrophes was not, in the end, able to survive this one. But perhaps the deepest mystery is not in the ocean. Perhaps it is in the land plants. Because when you look at what happened to vegetation at the KPG boundary, the story is strange in a different way, and it changes how we understand everything. The story of the vegetation at the KPG boundary is one of the most vivid and haunting in all of paleontology, and it tends to get overlooked in discussions dominated by the drama of the dinosaurs and the marine reptiles. But it should not be overlooked, because the plants tell us something about the extinction event that nothing else quite does. They give us a picture of what the world actually looked like, not just what was dying, but what kind of dying it was, and how long it lasted. The primary evidence comes from pollen and spores preserved in sedimentary rocks at and around the KPG boundary. Pollen is extraordinarily resistant to decay. Once it falls into sediment, it can persist for millions of years, identifiable to genus or even species level, and pollen is produced in enormous quantities, so even a thin layer of sediment contains abundant samples of whatever plants were growing nearby. What the pollen record shows is this. Immediately above the KPG boundary layer, in sediments deposited in the first thousands of years after the impact, there is a dramatic shift in plant communities. The diverse late Cretaceous flora, with its flowering plants, its cycads, its conifers, its varied ferns, disappears almost entirely. And in its place, dominating the sediment layers for a period of time, is a single type of spore, fern spores, ferns. This is called the fern spike, and it is one of the most consistent and striking features of the KPG boundary record in terrestrial environments around the world. In the first period after the impact, however long that period was, whether months or years, ferns colonized the devastated landscape and dominated it to an overwhelming degree. This pattern is not unique to the KPE boundary. We see fern spikes in other contexts, after volcanic eruptions for instance. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, the landscape it devastated was colonized first by ferns, which spread from underground rhizomes that survived the destruction. Ferns are pioneer plants. They are good at colonizing bare, disturbed ground where nothing else is yet growing. The KPG fern spike tells us, more viscerally than any set of numbers, what the world looked like after the impact. The forests were gone. The flowering plant communities that had evolved and diversified over tens of millions of years. The same communities that the herbivorous dinosaurs had been eating, the same plants that the insects had been pollinating, the same vegetation that had been sheltering and feeding and sheltering again the complicated web of late Cretaceous life. Those communities were devastated, not permanently. That is the important thing. The forests eventually returned. Flowering plant diversity recovered. Within a few million years, terrestrial plant communities were thriving again, even if they were composed of somewhat different species than before. But in the immediate aftermath, the world was a fern meadow, a vast, globally extended clearing. Now think about what that means for the animals. Herbivorous dinosaurs did not eat ferns preferentially. The large hadrosaurids, the ceratopsians, the sauropods, they fed on the rich and varied plant communities of the Cretaceous. When those communities collapsed, the herbivores lost their food supply, and when the herbivores began to die, the carnivores that preyed on them, the tyrannosaurs, the large dromaeosaurs, lost their food supply in turn. This cascade is the heart of the terrestrial extinction, and the fern spike makes it tangible, real, visible in the rock in a way that is almost heartbreaking if you sit with it long enough. But here is where it gets strange again, because the fern spike was relatively brief. In most sections it represents a relatively thin layer, perhaps corresponding to a few hundred or a few thousand years. And after the fern spike, plant communities began to recover and diversify, relatively quickly in geological terms. If the darkness and cold of the impact, winter lasted only a few years, or even a decade or two, then the plant communities might have begun recovering on a timescale of tens to hundreds of thousands of years, which means that within, say, 50,000 years of the impact, the worst of the disruption to terrestrial food webs might have been over. And 50,000 years, while it sounds long, is not long enough for large animals to evolve in response. It is, however, more than long enough for large animals to go extinct, especially if their populations have been severely reduced and they are struggling to reproduce fast enough to replace the individuals being lost to starvation. So the picture that emerges is something like this. The impact and its immediate aftermath devastated global ecosystems within a few years. Over the following decades and centuries, the worst disruption eased. Over the following thousands and tens of thousands of years, ecosystems began to recover and reorganize. But for the large, slow reproducing animals that had been most severely affected, this recovery came too late. Their populations had crashed below viable levels. They could not recover. This is a plausible and broadly supported narrative, but it still doesn't explain the crocodilians, or the turtles, or the specific pattern of which plant species recovered fastest and which did not. And there is one more piece of the puzzle that we have not yet discussed, one that adds another layer of complexity to an already beautifully complicated story. The question of what was happening to the climate before the asteroid arrived. Not the Deccan volcanism, which we've already discussed. Something else, something subtler and longer term. There is a rhythm to Earth's history that operates on timescales no individual life can perceive. A slow breathing of the planet, continents drifting, sea levels rising and falling, climates warming and cooling, that unfolds over millions of years and reshapes the conditions for life in ways that no single catastrophic event can fully replicate. In the late Cretaceous, this rhythm was producing some significant changes, and those changes, subtle as they were by geological standards, may have been adding to the stresses on late Cretaceous ecosystems in ways that made the eventual impact more devastating than it might otherwise have been. One of the most important of these changes was a global regression of sea levels. Throughout most of the Cretaceous, sea levels were very high, higher in fact than at any time in the past 100 million years. This high sea stand was caused by the configuration of the world's tectonic plates, many of them rifting and spreading, which displaced water from the ocean basins and caused it to flood low-lying continental areas. The great epicontinental seas of the Cretaceous, the Western Interior Seaway in North America, the Tethys Sea in what is now southern Eurasia, were direct products of these high sea levels. These shallow inland seas were, ecologically, enormously productive. They provided habitat for vast communities of marine organisms. They moderated the climates of adjacent land areas, keeping temperatures more equable and reducing the range between summer and winter extremes. They influenced precipitation patterns, bringing moisture into the interiors of continents that might otherwise have been dry. In the final few million years of the Cretaceous, sea levels began to drop, slowly at first, then more substantially. The Western Interior Seaway began to shrink, eventually splitting into two separate basins. Shallow marine habitats were lost as the seas retreated. The climatic moderation they provided diminished, and continental interiors became somewhat more extreme in their temperature ranges. This was not a sudden or dramatic change, but it was a real one, and it would have had real effects on the organisms that depended on those shallow sea ecosystems and on the land animals whose climatic conditions were shifting. Simultaneously, there is evidence that the global climate of the very late Cretaceous was becoming somewhat cooler and more variable than it had been in the peak warmth of earlier Cretaceous times. The extreme warmth of the mid-Cretaceous, a period sometimes called the Cretaceous thermal maximum, when there were no polar ice caps and tropical temperatures extended into higher latitudes, had already begun to moderate. The latest Cretaceous was still warm by modern standards, but it was cooling. Cooling, more variable climate, falling sea levels, shrinking shallow sea habitats. These changes would have affected marine organisms by reducing available habitat and disrupting the temperature regimes in which many species had evolved. They would have affected land animals by changing vegetation patterns, altering the distribution of food resources, and, for large dinosaurs with limited ability to regulate their body temperature behaviorally, potentially stressing populations that had evolved in more thermally stable conditions. Again, these were not dramatic or rapid changes by any human standard. We are talking about millions of years of gradual shift. But for organisms adapted to specific conditions, even gradual shift can create accumulating pressure. And there is a fascinating but controversial hypothesis that builds on this long-term climate change context, that some large dinosaur lineages, in some regions, were already experiencing population-level stress from these environmental changes in the last few million years of the Cretaceous. Not extinction, not even close, but reduced population sizes, reduced connectivity between populations, reduced genetic diversity. A kind of quiet thinning that made them more vulnerable when the catastrophic disruption arrived. This hypothesis has been criticized on several grounds. The fossil evidence for it is equivocal. The magnitude of the long-term climate changes, while real, was probably not sufficient to drive major groups toward extinction on its own. And there are regions, parts of Asia, parts of South America, where the latest Cretaceous dinosaur fauna appears, from what fossil evidence we have, to have been diverse and robust right up to the end. But the hypothesis cannot be entirely dismissed. It is a reasonable extrapolation from what we know about how modern ecosystems respond to climate change, applied to a deep time context. What we can say with some confidence is this: the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous were living in a world that was changing, slowly, subtly, but genuinely changing. The seas were a little lower, the climate a little more variable, the habitats a little different from what they had been in the earlier phases of the Cretaceous. Whether this made them more or less vulnerable to the final catastrophe is a question we cannot yet fully answer, but it is worth noting because it reminds us that the extinction is not a simple story with a single cause. The Earth is a complex system, and the end of the Cretaceous was a complex moment in that system's long history. We have covered much ground tonight, dear listener. We have walked through the richness of the world that was lost, considered the impact that changed everything, puzzled over the survivors and the victims, explored the role of volcanism and long-term climate change, listened to what the plants and the pollen have to say about those terrible years after the impact. And still the mystery remains in some ways unsolved. Let us take one more step into it. The step that many scientists consider the most philosophically interesting of all. The question of what the extinction can tell us about the nature of evolution itself and about life's resilience and its fragility over deep time. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called contingency. It refers to the idea that evolution is not a directed process moving towards some predetermined goal, but a series of accidents, mutations, environmental changes, chance encounters, random events that happen to produce the outcomes we observe. History, in this view, could always have gone differently. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs is perhaps the single most powerful illustration of contingency in the history of life on Earth. Because if you change one thing, one seemingly small detail in the events of 66 million years ago, the entire subsequent history of life on this planet is different, and perhaps radically so. If the asteroid had arrived at a slightly different angle, it might have delivered less of its energy into the atmosphere and more into the crust, reducing the severity of the global darkening. If it had hit in a different location, deep ocean rather than shallow carbonate-rich coastal water for instance, the composition and duration of the atmospheric disruption would have been very different. If it had been even 10% smaller, the impact might have been severe but not globally catastrophic, and in any of those scenarios, the dinosaurs probably survive. We know this because there have been other large impact events in Earth's history that did not cause mass extinctions, the Chesapeake Bay impact, the Popeye impact, several others. Events large enough to have been catastrophic regionally, but not globally lethal. The Chicxulub impactor was, by the standards of Earth's impact history, extraordinarily large. It was an outlier, a catastrophically improbable event. If the non-avian dinosaurs had survived, if that particular asteroid had missed or had hit differently, then the ecological space that the mammals eventually filled would have remained occupied. The mammals, constrained by dinosaurian competition, would have remained small and marginal. There would be no ecological release, no mammalian radiation, no evolution of large-bodied primates, no evolution of tool use and language and symbolic thought, and the peculiar species that is now, 66 million years later, lying in a comfortable bed thinking about all of this. We exist because of an asteroid. Our entire civilization, every piece of art, every scientific discovery, every act of love or kindness or cruelty in all of human history, is a downstream consequence of a rock from space arriving at exactly the wrong place and the wrong time for the non-avian dinosaurs, and exactly the right place and the right time for the small furry creatures that became our ancestors. That is a staggering thought, and it deserves a moment of quiet contemplation. But there is another dimension to this that I find equally remarkable, and it is about resilience rather than contingency. Life on Earth has experienced 5 major mass extinction events in its history. Each one has killed somewhere between 60 and 96% of all species on Earth. Each one has fundamentally reorganized the biosphere, eliminating dominant groups and allowing previously marginal ones to diversify and take over. And yet, after each one, life has recovered. Not the same life, never the same species, never the same ecological configurations, but life. Vigorously, diversely, eventually. The end Cretaceous extinction killed approximately 75% of all species on Earth. 3 out of every 4 species that existed at the time were gone within a relatively brief geological interval. And yet, within 10 million years, a number that sounds large but is, on the timescale of life's history, relatively brief, the world was again full of large animals. Within 20 million years, it was arguably more diverse in some respects than it had been before. Life does not give up easily. It bends around catastrophe, finds the cracks and crevices where survival is possible, and then pours itself back into the world with extraordinary creativity and persistence. This is not a comforting fact in the context of the current biodiversity crisis. We should be extremely clear about that. The recovery after mass extinctions takes millions of years. We will not be there to see it. The species we are currently driving extinct will not come back on any timescale relevant to human civilization. The comparison between natural mass extinctions and human-caused biodiversity loss is a real and concerning one, and the deep time record does not give us license to be sanguine about what we are doing to the natural world. But on the deepest timescale, on the scale of Earth's history, the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs is a story about both loss and recovery, about the end of one world and the beginning of another, about the extraordinary resilience of life and the equally extraordinary power of chance events to reshape it. There is one more thing I want to say before we begin our gentle descent into the final passages of this story tonight. Scientists disagree about the extinction of the dinosaurs in ways that are real and important and not likely to be resolved soon. The data is incomplete, the methods are contested, the interpretations vary, and this is not a failure of science. This is science working as it should, with incomplete evidence, honest uncertainty, continuing investigation, and the humility to say, "We don't know," when that is the truest answer. The mystery of the dinosaur extinction is not a solved problem with a few minor loose ends. It is a genuinely open question with multiple competing hypotheses, each supported by real evidence and each facing real objections. The asteroid is real. The KPG boundary is real. The pattern of extinction and survival is real. But the explanation, the full, detailed, satisfying account of exactly why what happened, is still being worked out. And there is something beautiful in that. There is something beautiful about a question that has been asked for as long as we have been finding dinosaur bones. A question that has generated so much careful thought and painstaking fieldwork and genuine scientific argument. A question that still has not been fully answered. It means the investigation continues. It means that somewhere, right now, a paleontologist is carefully brushing dust from a bone in a remote outcrop and does not yet know what they are about to find. It means that a geochemist is analysing a new sample from a rock layer near the KPG boundary and wondering what the numbers mean. It means that a graduate student is staring at a map of fossil localities, trying to see a pattern that no one has noticed before. The dinosaurs are gone. But the questions they have left behind, the questions encoded in their bones and in the rocks that surround them, in the chemistry of ancient seabeds and the pollen preserved in ancient mud, those questions are very much alive. And tonight, as you let your thoughts become soft and unhurried, as the day's concerns drift slowly away, from you like clouds dissolving at the edges, I hope you can take a moment to feel how extraordinary it is to live in a time when these questions can be asked at all. When the bones can be found and analysed and thought about deeply. When the story of a world 66 million years gone can be reconstructed, however incompletely, from the evidence it left behind. We are the species that came after, the beneficiaries of the disaster, and we are also, perhaps uniquely, the species that can look back across 66 million years and wonder what it was like, what those last days were and what was lost. That capacity for wonder, for looking at the deep past and feeling something about it, is not a small thing. It is one of the most distinctly human things there is, and so we come to rest here, at the end of our long journey through deep time. We have travelled far tonight, through the lush, warm forests of the late Cretaceous, among creatures that ruled the earth for longer than our own lineage has existed in any form. We have stood at the edge of the KPG boundary and looked at the thin, dark line in the rock where the world changed. We have asked why the crocodiles survived and the ceratopsians did not, why the ammonites disappeared after surviving everything else, why the ferns came back first and the forests came slowly after. We have sat with uncertainty, with the honest, humble admission that science has not yet assembled all the pieces of this puzzle into a complete picture, and perhaps we have found some comfort in that uncertainty, in the reminder that the world is large and old and full of mysteries that resist easy resolution. The dinosaurs are not entirely gone, of course. Every bird that sings in the morning is their heir, every crow solving a problem, every swift cutting arcs through summer air, every penguin navigating the Antarctic Ocean. These are dinosaurs, changed almost beyond recognition but carrying within them the genetic legacy of a dynasty that lasted 165 million years. The story did not end, it transformed, as stories in the natural world tend to do, and now, as your thoughts slow and soften, as the images of ancient landscapes and enormous creatures gradually give way to the easier darkness of approaching sleep. Let them go gently. Let the ferns come back, spreading their green across the emptied world. Let the mammals begin their slow emergence from burrow and shadow. Let the birds lift into the cooling air and carry the future forward on feathered wings. The Earth has seen so much. It has held so many worlds within it, one laid atop another, each one ended and the next begun. And it holds us now, in this moment, this thin and extraordinary present, on the surface of a planet old beyond imagining. Here is something that will quietly rearrange the furniture of your mind, if you let it. The Chicxulub asteroid did not have to hit where it hit, and where it hit, the specific geology of that precise location on the Yucatan Peninsula, may be the single most consequential accident in the history of life on this planet. Let us slow down and really sit with this. When researchers began studying the Chicxulub impact crater in detail, drilling into the buried structure, analysing the chemical composition of the rock that the asteroid struck, modelling what the impact would have released into the atmosphere, they found something extraordinary, something that changed the conversation about the extinction in a quiet but profound way. The rock beneath the Yucatan Peninsula at the time of impact was not average rock. It was an unusually thick sequence of sulfur-rich sedimentary material, specifically a formation rich in anhydrite and other sulfate minerals. When the asteroid struck this particular type of rock and vaporized it, the explosion released an enormous amount of sulfur into the atmosphere, far more sulfur than a similar impact into granite or basalt or deep ocean sediment would have produced. Sulfur in the atmosphere forms sulfate aerosols. Sulfate aerosols reflect sunlight, and reflecting sunlight is precisely what makes an impact winter severe. Researchers running computer models of the Chicxulub impact have estimated that if the asteroid had struck a different part of Earth, one without that thick sulfur-rich layer, the global cooling effect would have been dramatically reduced. Some estimates suggest that an impact of the same size into deep ocean rock or into continental granite might have produced a cooling event lasting months rather than years. Severe, certainly, perhaps regionally catastrophic, but not the decade-long global winter that the sulfate release appears to have generated. If the asteroid had hit almost anywhere else, and given that 70% of Earth's surface is ocean, and that the continents themselves are largely composed of rock without the Yucatan's unusual sulfate richness, the extinction might have been dramatically less severe. The non-avian dinosaurs might have survived. We exist as a species not just because an asteroid hit Earth, but because it hit a very specific patch of the Gulf of Mexico coastline where the geology happened to be precisely wrong, or precisely right, depending on your perspective. And it gets stranger still, because there is another piece to this geographic accident. The angle of impact matters too. When an asteroid strikes at a low angle, coming in shallow across the horizon rather than dropping nearly vertically, more of its energy is directed laterally, into the atmosphere, rather than downward, into the crust. The ejector thrown up by a low-angle impact travels further and covers a larger area. The atmospheric injection of material is greater. Analysis of the Chicxulub crater structure has suggested that the impactor came in at a relatively shallow angle, somewhere between 30 and 60 degrees with some estimates favouring the lower end of that range. This would have maximised the amount of material thrown into the atmosphere, maximising the duration and severity of the impact winter. A steeper impact would have buried more energy in the ground and thrown less material skyward. A more vertical impact into the same sulfur-rich rock would still have been devastating locally, but might not have produced the global atmospheric disruption that killed 3/4 of Earth's species. The asteroid hit at exactly the wrong angle, in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. I find it almost impossible to fully absorb this. The entire arc of mammalian evolution, our own existence, everything we have ever been or done or dreamed, balanced on the precise trajectory of a rock travelling through space 66 million years ago. Contingency. Absolute, breathtaking contingency. But here is where the twist deepens into something even stranger. Because while we have been examining the impact from the perspective of where it happened and how it happened, a group of researchers has been asking a very different question. When exactly, in the year, did the impact happen? And the answer, still contested, still being worked out, suggests that even the season of impact may have mattered, may have determined who lived and who died. This is a relatively recent development in impact research, and it is one of those findings that, when you first encounter it, seems almost too specific to be real. But the evidence is compelling, and the implications are remarkable. In 2022, researchers studying a remarkable fossil site in North Dakota, Tanis, a location that appears to preserve organisms killed in the immediate aftermath of the Chicxulub impact, including fish that may have died within hours of the strike, published analyses suggesting that the impact occurred in the Northern Hemisphere's late spring or early summer. How do we know this? The evidence comes from several sources, but one of the most elegant is the growth patterns in the bones of fish found at the site. Fish lay down annual growth rings in their bones, similar to the rings in a tree trunk, and the pattern of growth at the time of death, how far through the annual growth cycle the bone was when growth stopped, can indicate the season. The fish at Tanis appear to have died in a period of active growth, consistent with late spring or early summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Additionally, the stomach contents of some animals at the site, and the plant material preserved alongside them, suggest a Northern Hemisphere spring or early summer context. Now, why does this matter? Because the effects of an impact winter depend critically on what stage of the annual cycle different organisms are at when the darkness arrives. In the Northern Hemisphere in late spring or early summer, many plants are at a growth phase. The year's first flush of vegetation has emerged, but the seeds and stored nutrients of winter have been largely consumed. Many animals are in breeding season, with dependent young that are not yet capable of independent survival. Migratory species are in transit, often far from their wintering grounds. Cold-blooded animals are active and have elevated metabolic demands. In the Southern Hemisphere at the same moment, it is late autumn approaching winter. Plants are preparing for dormancy. Animals are building fat reserves. Seeds and stored nutrients are at their annual peak. The asymmetry is significant. An impact winter arriving in Northern Hemisphere late spring would have found Northern Hemisphere ecosystems at their most vulnerable. Least stored energy, most dependent young, most active metabolisms. Southern Hemisphere ecosystems, approaching winter anyway, might have been somewhat better positioned to endure sudden cooling and darkness. This hypothesis is being actively investigated and debated. The evidence from Tanis is genuinely extraordinary. It appears to be one of the most remarkable fossil sites ever discovered, preserving a snapshot of the immediate aftermath of the impact in extraordinary detail. But interpreting it is complex, and not everyone is convinced that the seasonal signal is as clear as some researchers have claimed. But if the timing is correct, if the impact did arrive in Northern Hemisphere late spring, it adds yet another layer to the story, another dimension of coincidence and contingency. The world ended in what should have been a time of renewal and growth, and the asymmetry of that timing may have contributed to the asymmetry of the extinction itself. Some researchers have suggested that organisms in the Southern Hemisphere may have fared somewhat better in the immediate aftermath of the impact than those in the Northern Hemisphere, though the darkness would eventually have been global, and the difference in survival rates between hemispheres is not dramatic at the level of major groups, but at the margins, in the fine-grained pattern of which population survived and which did not, the seasonal context of the impact may have mattered. I want to pause here for a moment as we settle deeper into the night and acknowledge something. Every time we think we have the extinction story neatly summarized, big rock, impact winter, everything dies, mammals take over, we find another layer, another variable, another complication, the angle of impact, the geology of the impact site, the season of the year, the pre-existing state of the global climate, the volcanic activity already underway, the sea levels already dropping. Each new piece of evidence makes the story more specific, more detailed, more real, and also, paradoxically, more mysterious. Because each new detail raises new questions about how all these factors interacted, about which ones were decisive and which were incidental, about what would have been different if any single one of them had been slightly different. The extinction is not a simple story. It never was, and the more carefully we look, the more complex it becomes. Let us look at one more complexity, one that involves not rocks or seasons or chemistry, but something stranger still, the possibility that some dinosaurs survived the impact, at least briefly, and then went extinct for reasons that had nothing to do with the asteroid. This next twist requires a careful framing, because it is a hypothesis that remains genuinely contested and that many paleontologists regard with considerable skepticism. But it is based on real evidence, argued by serious scientists, and it changes the story in fascinating ways if it holds up. The claim is this: some non-avian dinosaurs may have survived the initial impact and its immediate aftermath, the impact winter, the global fires, the darkest years, and lived on into the early Paleogene for a period that could have been as brief as a few thousand years or as long as a few 100,000 years. The evidence comes from a small number of sites around the world where dinosaur bones have been found in sedimentary rock layers that appear to date to after the KPG boundary. These are called Paleocene dinosaur remains, and their existence, if they are genuinely Paleocene in age, would mean that at least some non-avian dinosaurs persisted past the canonical extinction event. The most discussed of these sites is in the San Juan Basin of New Mexico, where fragmentary hadrosaur material has been found in rock that appears, based on its stratigraphic position, to date to approximately several tens of thousands of years after the KPG boundary. Similarly, sites in China and elsewhere have yielded material that some researchers have interpreted as post-boundary dinosaur remains. The skeptical response to these findings, and it is the majority response among paleontologists, is what is called reworking. The argument is that the bones were not actually deposited in Paleocene sediments, but were eroded out of older Cretaceous rock and redeposited in younger sediment. This is a known phenomenon. Fossils can travel. They can be washed out of their original context by erosion and come to rest in geological formations that are younger than the bones themselves. Given that the claimed Paleocene dinosaur sites are all represented by fragmentary, often isolated bones, rather than articulated skeletons in undisturbed sedimentary context, the reworking explanation is very plausible. Most researchers who have looked carefully at these sites have concluded that reworking is the most likely explanation, but not all of them. A minority of researchers remains open to the possibility that at least some populations of non-avian dinosaurs persisted briefly into the Paleogene, living on in environments that were recovering faster than average, or in geographic refugia where conditions were less severe. What is interesting about this hypothesis, regardless of whether the specific fossil evidence for it ultimately holds up, is what it implies about the nature of the extinction. If some populations survived the initial catastrophe, what eventually killed them? Why did they not recover and persist? The answer under this scenario would be something like ecological displacement. As mammalian communities began to diversify and expand, filling the ecological niches left vacant by the mass extinction, the surviving dinosaur populations would have faced increasing competition. They would have been small, fragmented, probably genetically compromised, and the mammals, with their faster reproductive rates and perhaps greater ecological flexibility, would gradually have outcompeted them. This is a speculative scenario, but it is not an implausible one, and it points to something important. Extinction is not always a single dramatic event. Sometimes it is a process drawn out over time with survivors and holdouts and gradual diminishment. The last of a group is rarely the last to die in a catastrophe. It is often the last to lose a competition that the catastrophe made inevitable. We see this pattern in modern extinctions. When human activity devastates a habitat, the large, slow-reproducing megafauna often don't all die immediately. They persist, in reduced numbers, in degraded habitat, slowly declining over decades or centuries until the population becomes too small to sustain itself. The end comes slowly, then all at once, or rather quietly, when the last few individuals age and die without reproducing successfully. Perhaps the non-avian dinosaurs died like this. Not all at once in a firestorm, but gradually, in shrinking refugia, in a world that was slowly but irrevocably transforming around them. Until one day, in some scrubby forest, on some recovering continent, the last one died, and there was no one to notice, and no record was left in the stone, and we will probably never know precisely when or where. That image, the last dinosaur unremarked in a world already moving on, is one I find unexpectedly moving. There is something in it about the nature of endings that resonates beyond the specific story of a geological period 66 million years ago. But let us move on to what I think is the most philosophically disorienting twist of all, the one that challenges not just our understanding of the extinction, but our entire framework for thinking about what a dinosaur is. We need to talk about birds again, but differently this time. Earlier in our journey tonight, we noted that birds are technically dinosaurs. Let us now sit with that fact properly and let it do what it is capable of doing, which is quietly reorganizing the entire story. The traditional framing of the extinction goes like this. 66 million years ago, the dinosaurs went extinct. The birds survived and evolved separately. End of story. But this framing is scientifically incorrect. It is not a simplification or a useful approximation. It is wrong. Birds did not survive and evolve separately. Birds are dinosaurs. They are not descended from dinosaurs in the way that humans are descended from apes, a metaphor that implies separation, divergence, the old group being left behind while the new group moves forward. Birds are nested within the dinosaur family tree in a much tighter way than that. They are theropod dinosaurs. They are avian dinosaurs. They are, in the same way that bats are mammals, simply one lineage within a larger group that happens to have developed a distinctive suite of characteristics. So when we say the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, we are being imprecise. What we mean is that the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. The avian dinosaurs, or the birds, did not. They survived, and today there are approximately 10,500 known species of them, living on every continent, occupying almost every ecological niche, ranging in size from the bee hummingbird, which weighs less than 2 grams, to the ostrich, which can weigh over 150 kilograms. There are, by number of species, more dinosaurs alive today than there were at the end of the Cretaceous. We simply don't call them dinosaurs, we call them birds. Now, why does this matter for our story about the extinction? It matters because it changes what we are explaining. The question is not, why did the dinosaurs go extinct? Because they didn't, entirely. The question is, why did the non-avian dinosaurs go extinct while the avian ones survived? And that is a very different question. It is a question about the specific characteristics that separated the two groups at a particular moment in time, in a particular environmental context. And here is where the twist gets genuinely strange. We're not entirely sure what those characteristics were. The early naive answer is flight. Birds can fly. Flight allowed them to escape danger, to reach resources in areas inaccessible to ground-dwelling animals, to cross bodies of water and reach refugia unavailable to terrestrial species. Flight saved them. But this answer falls apart under scrutiny in multiple ways. First, many birds of the late Cretaceous were not strong flyers, or were flightless altogether. There were numerous lineages of early birds, enantiornithnines for instance, a diverse and apparently successful group that were at least partially terrestrial in their habits, and almost all of them went extinct. It was not flight in general that saved the birds, it was something more specific about the particular lineage that gave rise to modern birds. Second, flight is metabolically expensive. Flying animals need to eat a lot. The impact winter, with its collapsed food webs, would have been at least as severe a challenge for flying animals as for ground dwellers. The advantage of flight, access to more territory in search of food, might have been offset by the increased energetic cost of flight itself. Third, pterosaurs flew. They had been flying for over 150 million years by the end of the Cretaceous, and they were extraordinarily diverse, occupying niches from filter feeding in coastal waters to soaring high above inland forests. They went extinct at the KPG boundary entirely. If flight was sufficient protection against the extinction, the pterosaurs should have survived. They didn't. So flight is not the answer, or not the whole answer. What then? The characteristics that researchers have identified as potentially significant in the survival of the avian dinosaurian lineage are more subtle and more interesting than flight. One is diet. The specific group of birds that appears to have given rise to all modern species may have had the capacity to eat seeds. Seeds are a remarkable food source in the context of an impact winter. Unlike green plant material, seeds do not require ongoing photosynthesis. They can lie dormant in the soil for extended periods, years in some cases, remaining viable and nutritious. An animal that can find and eat seeds can potentially survive a period when all active plant growth has ceased. This is the seed-eating hypothesis, and it has been supported by anatomical evidence. The jaw and beak structure of early modern-type birds suggests seed-crushing capability, and by ecological argument. But the enantiornithnines, the group of early birds that did not survive, were apparently also capable of exploiting a variety of food sources. Some of them had beak structures suggesting they ate seeds, insects and plant material. So why did they go extinct while the ancestors of modern birds survived? Here we run into the limits of our evidence. The fossil record of early birds is fragmentary. We know less about their ecology, their behaviour, their physiology, and their geographic distribution than we would like. The difference between the survivors and the victims may have been small, a slight edge in dietary flexibility, a slightly faster reproductive rate, a slightly more southerly distribution at the time of impact. And those small differences, compounded over thousands of years of post-impact recovery, were enough to determine the outcome. Or there may have been something more fundamental that we haven't yet identified. This is one of the great open questions in vertebrate paleontology. And it is open not because researchers haven't tried to answer it, but because the evidence is genuinely insufficient at this point to resolve it definitively. What I find most remarkable, sitting with this uncertainty, is the implication it carries. If the difference between survival and extinction, at the family level, at the level of entire lineages, was perhaps quite small, perhaps even largely random in its specifics, then the survival of any particular group through the KPG extinction was not inevitable. It was not the inevitable result of superior adaptations. It was, in significant part, a matter of luck, of being in the right place with the right combination of characteristics at the right moment. We exist because our distant ancestors were among the luckiest survivors of an improbable catastrophe, and the characteristics we are most proud of, our intelligence, our social complexity, our capacity for culture and language, are not things that were inevitable products of evolution, inexorably building toward us. They are contingent. They are the products of a particular chain of improbable events. That is either a deeply humbling or a deeply liberating thought, depending on how you hold it. There is something I have been circling around throughout this entire journey tonight, something that hovers at the edges of almost every claim we've made and every mystery we've explored. It is time to address it directly. The dinosaur fossil record is profoundly, almost absurdly uneven. We have spent our entire evening discussing patterns, who survived, who didn't, what the ecosystems were doing before and after the extinction, and all of that discussion has been grounded ultimately in the fossil record. But the fossil record is not a neutral, comprehensive archive of past life. It is a deeply biased, geographically skewed, taphonomically filtered sample that may be systematically misleading us about the nature of the extinction. Consider what we actually know about late Cretaceous dinosaurs. The vast majority of our knowledge comes from a few extraordinarily productive fossil sites, almost all of them in North America, China, and Argentina. The famous Hell Creek Formation of Montana, North and South Dakota, and Wyoming, the Nemegt Formation of Mongolia, the Patagonian formations of Argentina, a handful of other productive localities. These sites are productive for specific reasons: the right type of rock, formed under the right depositional conditions now exposed, at the surface by erosion, located in countries with active paleontological research programs, accessible enough for fieldwork. But these localities represent a tiny, geographically biased sample of where dinosaurs actually lived. The dinosaurs of sub-Saharan Africa, of most of South and Southeast Asia, of Antarctica, of Australia. These are almost entirely unknown to us, not because they didn't exist, but because the right conditions for preservation and discovery haven't aligned in those regions. Antarctica, for instance, was not at the poles during the Cretaceous. It was considerably further north and had a temperate to subtropical climate, almost certainly supporting dinosaur fauna. We have found a handful of Cretaceous dinosaur bones there, but our knowledge of Antarctic dinosaurs is essentially nil. Africa, one of the largest and most biogeographically significant continents, has yielded relatively few late Cretaceous dinosaur remains compared to North America or China. The fossils are there, we know this from occasional discoveries, but the research infrastructure and geological exposure needed to find them systematically hasn't existed in most of the continent. The same is true of much of Asia and large portions of South America. This is not a minor caveat. It is a fundamental limitation on our ability to reconstruct what was happening globally in the late Cretaceous and at the KPG boundary. When we say that dinosaur diversity appears to have been declining in the latest Cretaceous, we're almost entirely describing what was happening in Western North America. When we say that the extinction was geologically instantaneous, we are mostly describing what we see in a few North American and European sections. When we say that no non-avian dinosaurs survived the KPG boundary, we are making a claim that our evidence can't fully support, because there are vast swaths of the planet where we simply don't know what was happening. The Paleocene of Africa, the period immediately after the extinction, is almost entirely unknown from a vertebrate paleontology perspective. What was living in African forests and grasslands in the first million years after the KPG boundary? We don't know. We genuinely don't know. Some researchers have suggested, partly on the basis of this ignorance, that there may have been localized dinosaur survivors in regions we haven't studied well, African, Australian or Antarctic populations that persisted for longer than the North American record would suggest. This is speculative. It may not be true, but we cannot rule it out with any confidence, because we simply don't have the evidence to look. There is a particular irony here that I find almost wistful. We know more about the extinction of the dinosaurs than about almost any other mass extinction in Earth's history. We have the Alvarez hypothesis, the Chicxulub crater, the iridium layer, decades of careful research, and yet the fundamental question, exactly what happened and why, remains genuinely stubbornly open, not because researchers haven't worked hard, but because the evidence we need is buried under kilometers of younger rock, or has eroded away entirely, or lies under deep ocean sediments in regions that have never been drilled, or is preserved in countries where the science hasn't yet been done. The extinction of the dinosaurs is simultaneously the best studied and the most mysterious mass extinction in Earth's history, and I find that remarkable, genuinely remarkable. Here is one that tends to get lost in the broader narrative. The mammalian survivors of the KPG extinction were not triumphant. They were not a robust, thriving group ready to take on the world. They were a battered, depleted remnant of what had existed before, clinging to survival by the slenderest of margins. Mammals had been around for approximately 185 million years by the time of the KPG extinction. During all that time, all those hundreds of millions of years of dinosaur dominance, the mammals had been small, mostly very small. They occupied the nocturnal niches, the burrowing niches, the insect-eating niches. They were, in ecological terms, the small creatures that lived in the margins of a world owned by dinosaurs. But they were also diverse, in their own way. At the end of the Cretaceous, there were dozens of distinct mammalian lineages, representing a surprising variety of body forms and ecological strategies. Multituberculates, rodent-like creatures with distinctive multicusped teeth, Gondwanatheria, an enigmatic southern hemisphere group, early placentals, early marsupials, monotremes, and several groups whose relationships to modern mammals are still debated. The KPG extinction killed many of them. This is not widely appreciated in the standard story of the extinction, which tends to cast the mammals straightforwardly as the winners, the group that benefited from the dinosaurs' demise and went on to inherit the Earth, and they did, ultimately. But the path from there to here was not smooth. Many mammalian lineages that had existed throughout the Cretaceous did not survive the KPG boundary. The multituberculates, one of the most successful and long-lived of all mammalian groups, having existed for over 100 million years, survived the extinction, but then declined and eventually disappeared in the Eocene, apparently outcompeted by rodents. The Gondwanatheria disappeared. Several other lineages that had been diversifying during the Cretaceous were gone by the end. The founding populations of the modern mammalian orders, the ancestors of all modern placental and marsupial mammals, appear to have been extraordinarily small at the time of the KPG boundary. Some estimates, based on molecular phylogenetic analyses, suggest that the entire diversity of modern placental mammals traces back to perhaps a handful of founding populations, possibly even a single surviving population, of a small, probably insectivorous ancestor. Think about that. Every whale and elephant and bat and primate and rodent and carnivore alive today may trace its ancestry to a small burrowing animal that survived the KPG extinction in a narrow refugium somewhere, probably in a hole in the ground, eating insects and seeds in the darkness while the world burned above. This founding bottleneck, if it happened, and the genetic evidence suggests something like it did, means that the mammalian radiation that followed the extinction was even more remarkable than it appears. The diversity of modern mammals, built up over 66 million years, started from almost nothing, from a handful of survivors in a devastated world. And the recovery was not immediate. The first 2 to 3 million years of the Paleogene are sometimes called the dead clades walking period, a time when surviving lineages were recovering, when ecosystems were slowly rebuilding, when the world was still, in many ways, ecologically impoverished compared to the richness of the Cretaceous. Many early Paleogene mammals were generalists, eating whatever they could find, living in whatever environments were available. The ecological specialization and the body size diversity that would eventually characterize mammalian communities took millions of years to develop. So the story of the KPG extinction from the mammalian perspective is not we survived and thrived. It is we barely survived, and then very slowly over millions of years we recovered. The difference between the mammalian experience of the extinction and the dinosaurian experience was not that mammals had a comfortable time while dinosaurs had a terrible one. Both groups had a terrible time. The difference was that one group had a handful of survivors in the right ecological contexts, and the other group did not. We have spent this journey looking backward, into deep time, into a world 66 million years removed from our own, accessible only through the careful interpretation of rock and bone and chemistry. But I want to take a moment, in the quiet of this late hour, to look forward, or rather, sideways, at the present. Because the forces that killed the dinosaurs are not historical curiosities. They are still operating. The Earth is still being struck by space rocks. Large volcanic systems are still active. The climate is still changing, though now with the additional driver of human activity. The patterns of extinction and survival that played out 66 million years ago are not relics. They are templates. The Earth is currently experiencing what many scientists describe as a sixth mass extinction. Unlike the previous 5, this one is being driven primarily by a single species, ours. Habitat destruction, climate change, overexploitation, pollution, invasive species. Through these mechanisms, human activity is currently driving species to extinction at a rate estimated to be anywhere from 10 to 1,000 times the natural background rate. The comparison to the KP extinction is imperfect in many ways. The mechanisms are different, the timescale is different, and the current extinction, while severe, has not yet, we have to hope, reached the scale of the end Cretaceous event. But some of the patterns are recognizable. Large animals with slow reproductive rates are disappearing first. Specialist species, those adapted to specific habitats or food sources, are more vulnerable than generalists. Freshwater ecosystems are stressed in ways that echo the detrital survival hypothesis we discussed earlier. The geographic pattern of loss is uneven, with some regions experiencing much more severe impacts than others, and some researchers have noted that if you were to look at the current extinction from 66 million years in the future, from the perspective of a species evolved enough to study fossils, you might see a pattern in the rock not entirely dissimilar to what we see at the KPG boundary. A layer where the large-bodied species disappear, where certain ecological guilds vanish, where the diversity of specific groups collapses abruptly. I am not saying this to induce despair. Despair is not the emotion the deep past tends to produce in me, as I sit with it in the late hours. What it produces is something more complex, a mixture of sorrow and awe and, if I am honest, a fierce protectiveness toward the extraordinary diversity of life that still exists. The dinosaurs didn't get a warning. They had no way to understand what was happening as the darkness gathered, as the food webs frayed, as the world cooled around them. They had no capacity to intervene, to choose differently, to step back from the precipice. We do. That is the most extraordinary difference between us and every extinction that came before. We are the first species in Earth's history that is capable of understanding in advance the threats that face the biosphere. We can read the rock record, we can model the climate, we can track asteroid trajectories, we can monitor species populations. We have knowledge that no other species in Earth's 4 billion year history has possessed. Whether we will use it wisely is a question that 66 million years of deep time and the quietly assembled bones of countless extinct species cannot answer for us. That part is ours. And so we arrive, finally at the last twist, the one that is perhaps the most honest and in its honesty the most interesting. We don't know, not entirely, not in the way that would satisfy a curious mind looking for a clean, complete, fully resolved answer. We know the asteroid was real, we know the Chicxulub crater is real, we know that iridium was deposited globally at the KPG boundary, we know that the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared, we know that mammals diversified dramatically afterward, we know that certain groups survived and others didn't. We know that the Deccan traps were erupting. We know that sea levels were dropping. We know that the world was already changing, but we do not know, with any certainty, the relative contribution of each of these factors to the final outcome. We do not know exactly how long the impact winter lasted, or how cold it got, or whether recovery was global and uniform or regional and patchy. We do not know whether any non-avian dinosaurs persisted briefly into the Paleogene. We do not know exactly why the specific birds that gave rise to all modern species survived while other bird lineages did not. We do not know whether the dinosaurs would eventually have recovered from the Deccan volcanism on their own if the asteroid had not arrived. We do not know what the dinosaur faunas of Africa, Antarctica, and most of Asia were doing in the final million years of the Cretaceous. These are not trivial gaps, they are fundamental uncertainties that affect our understanding of one of the most important events in the history of life on Earth. And this is okay. It is more than okay. It is the nature of science, and it is the nature of deep time. The past does not give up its secrets easily or completely. The evidence is always fragmentary. The interpretations are always provisional. The picture is always, in some ways, incomplete. The scientist who tells you they have fully explained the extinction of the dinosaurs is not being honest with you. The honest scientist says, here is what we know, here is what we think, here is what we're not sure about, and here is what we're still trying to find out. That honesty, that willingness to live with uncertainty and keep asking, is what has brought us as far as we've come. From a time when we didn't know fossils were the remains of once living creatures, to a time when we can extract chemical signatures from ancient bones and pollen from 66-million-year-old mud and use them to reconstruct in detail the last days of a world we can barely imagine. The bones of the Cretaceous are still out there, in rock formations not yet found, in sites not yet excavated, in countries not yet fully explored. Every year, new fossils are discovered that change some aspect of the picture. A new species, previously unknown. A new geographic location that extends a known species range. A new bone chemistry result that tells us something about diet or growth rate or physiology. Every year, the picture sharpens slightly, becomes slightly more detailed, slightly more complete, and every year it also becomes, in certain ways, slightly more mysterious, because every new discovery tends to raise new questions alongside the answers it provides. This is the nature of science at the frontier of knowledge, and the extinction of the dinosaurs is very much still a frontier. There is something I find deeply calming about that, here at the end of our long journey. The world is still full of things we do not understand. Questions that have not yet been asked, let alone answered. Fossils not yet found. Stories not yet told. The mystery is not a failure. It is an invitation to keep looking, to keep asking, to keep following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to more uncertainty rather than less. The dinosaurs lived and died and left their bones in the rock for us to find. Across 66 million years of time, they have been waiting, preserved in stone, to tell us things we did not know. And we have been listening slowly, carefully, with growing understanding. We are still listening. And so, dear listener, we have gone deeper into the mystery tonight. We have learned that the asteroid almost missed, that the season of impact may have mattered, that some non-avian dinosaurs may have briefly survived, that the birds, our window into the living dinosaurian legacy, survived not because of any single clear advantage, but through some combination of luck and flexibility and characteristics we still don't fully understand. We have learned that the mammals barely made it, and that the world after the extinction was not a triumphant place, but a slow and difficult recovery. We have looked sideways at our own moment in time and recognized the patterns from deep history playing out around us, in altered form, in the world we inhabit now. And we have, I hope, made some peace with not knowing everything. With sitting comfortably in the space between what is understood and what remains to be discovered. The bones are still in the rock. The questions are still alive. And somewhere, maybe, the answer to the thing we don't yet know is waiting to be found. In a cliff face in Patagonia, in a core drilled from the floor of the Indian Ocean, in a boulder tumbled down a hillside in the Badlands of Montana that no one has yet thought to look at closely. The mystery continues, and that is a beautiful thing. Let your mind rest now. Let the ancient world soften at its edges. Let the great creatures of the Cretaceous move quietly through the forests of your half-dreaming, slow and enormous and perfectly adapted to a world that was, for all its strangeness, as real as the one you wake to every morning. You're made of the same matter as they were. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, calcium. The same elements cycling through different forms across unimaginable spans of time. We're all in some sense made of old stars and ancient seas and the slowly turning wheel of deep time. Sleep gently. The mystery will still be there in the morning. Let that thought carry you softly down. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.